You're listening to the B-Town Breakdown, where we talk about life, art, local news, and all that jazz with your host, Alia Sinclair. Tune in for a new show every Friday at 106.5 KQWZ LP-FM, South King County.
Hello, and welcome to this week's show of the B-Town Breakdown, where we talk about life, art, and all that jazz. I'm your host, Alia Sinclair, and today we're going to kick off with a segment I call Food for Thought. As the new year settles in around us, it's normal to start losing steam with some of the goals you set for yourself in the new year. If you're like me, one of your struggles may be seeing self-improvement as some sort of outside force you have to appease, an angry overlord who is keeping track of everything you said you'd do and didn't, of every missed workout, fast food meal, hour spent scrolling instead of reading, racking up the demerits against you that start building a wall of failure so heavy you decide you're simply not self-improvement material and decide to give the whole thing up. And frankly, who wouldn't under that kind of judgment and scrutiny? Lately, when thinking about the nature of self-improvement and how difficult it can be to maintain, I had a realization. What if, instead of some exterior overlord tracking my every move and tallying up my failures, my goals were simply a promise I made myself, accountable only to myself, and able to show myself grace when I fell short of my own mark? This thought called to mind the famous essay Self-Respect by Joan Didion. Self-Respect was first published in Vogue in 1961, but can now be found in Didion's incredible collection of essays, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. In Self-Respect, Didion says, "Although to be driven back upon oneself is an uneasy affair at best, rather like trying to cross a border with borrowed credentials, it seems to me now the one condition necessary to the beginnings of real self-respect. Most of our platitudes notwithstanding, self-deception remains the most difficult deception. The tricks that work on others count for nothing in the very well-lit back alley where one keeps assignations with oneself. No winning smiles will do here, no prettily drawn lists of good intentions. One shuffles flashily but in vain through one's marked cards, the kindness done for the wrong reason, the apparent triumph which involved no real effort, the seemingly heroic act into which one had been shamed. The dismal fact is that self-respect has nothing to do with the approval of others, who are, after all, deceived easily enough. Maybe the overlord we imagine is simply a complex self-deception devised to convince ourselves that we cannot be all we're capable of. Perhaps if we are to grow in true self-respect, we can acknowledge that self-deception for what it is, fear, and instead go on with our eyes firmly inward, not shrinking at our own internal gaze, because we have already sought ourselves out and found ourselves true to what we are, no deceptions, fears, or failure. Only gently calling ourselves back to the one true home we'll ever have, the universe inside ourselves.
You're listening to the B-Town Breakdown, where we talk about life, art, local news, and all that jazz with your host, Alia Sinclair, at 106.5 KQWZ LP-FM, South King County.
Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Alia Sinclair, and you're listening to the B-Town Breakdown, where we talk about life, art, and all that jazz. Today I'm here with artist, writer, and columnist Raymond Street. Hello, and thanks for being here.
Oh, hello. Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to start with some background on your work as an artist and how it relates to this community specifically.
All right. Well, I've been kind of interested in arts my whole life. I was a poet when I was in middle school, and like most people, you do poetry and you hide it in weird books that you forget about and look at later, and semi-embarrassment. But I've done that my whole life, and I've really enjoyed writing poetry. And it wasn't until 2013, 2012, my girlfriend got involved volunteering, and I started volunteering with her. And in doing that, I got exposed to artists and art events and receptions and all sorts of things. And after that, I just kind of stayed there because I love art. I mean, it's one of those things that doesn't have like a strict authority. I mean, there are some authorities like how much the market will produce of, consume of your artwork. Okay, but like whether or not it's good art or bad art or personal art, like that's anybody's type of thing. So I love it. There's so many people in the art community that have different ways of thinking and talking and ways of looking at the world that, that's kind of how I got involved in doing art.
Awesome. Is there a specific arts organization locally that you volunteered with?
I've done a couple over the years, but the one I'm kind of interacting with right now is the Normandy Park Art Commission. So it's a municipal commission that has kind of like a yearly program of music, concerts, and we have a rotation of artwork in our council chambers exhibition throughout the year, and we do all sorts of stuff. We just had a big holiday event, a solstice event in December that had a handbell choir and an orchestra, and it was all like ice and themed and stuff. We had an ice sculpture. It was a good time.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. Ice sculpture.
Yeah. It's the first time I've ever had an event with an ice sculpture that I've been a part of, and that was kind of it was a cool experience.
Yeah, I bet. I do a little bit of wood carving, and so I try to imagine what ice must be like to work with. If you get it too warm, it's like, oh no, the arm is melting.
Yeah, so the guys that brought in the ice sculpture, they set it up, and they have lights and things like that, and it's all something that you can deal with as a host. Like, they don't have to have a special thing. You set up this thing with a drain that has like the melt go through, and then it takes about an hour to get rid of this kind of haze on it, because the image that is sculpted is on the other side of the ice, so you're looking through it. Anyway,
that's very cool.
Yeah, it was kind of a neat experience.
Yeah, I love that. So I'd love to hear more about your art in particular. You've mentioned poetry. I know you also write short stories.
Yeah.
And I know you've self-published a great deal. And I think that's something that there'd be a lot of interest in. I think lots of people are interested in self-publishing. So I'd love to hear your experience with that and how you fell into it, and if you would have any advice or words of caution to anyone who might be interested.
So I got involved in self-publishing through an art commissioner who told me that a lot of his experiences with literature was when he was in college. This is the late Zen. He's an art commissioner that I would consider somebody who is a great example of a leader. But he encouraged me to keep writing. I started just doing short stories and poetry. He's like, oh, that's totally how people used to consume them when he went to college. So I did that, and I got into self-publishing because I didn't hear back from tons of publishers. Like, you go down the line and you submit to all these places. Some people require like a payment. Like, some places require that you pay to submit. Pay to play, and I did some of that. Like, I've tried all sorts of stuff. But while you're waiting to hear back, which sometimes you don't hear back, I just kept on doing it. So I would print stuff at a local printer, All-Star Printing in Burien, has printed my stuff throughout the years. And then I've done Amazon printing. So a lot of the internet has opened up the ability to just upload your art and your stuff, and you retain, the publishing rights as long as it's on this platform type of thing. And then when you want, you can delete it and go do something else with it. And it allowed it to grow without having to be burdened by the idea of success if you have to get a major publisher to pick up your stuff.
Yes. And you do visual art as well. Is that true? You do illustrations of your poetry in tandem?
I do. So I started doing just pictures, like paintings, and just getting into the art and learning about what it means to do that. But my partner and a couple of other people really encouraged me to try to do artwork for the things I was writing about.
Yeah.
And that added another kind of like dimension to understanding the ideas. And I really enjoyed it. I do illustrations for my artwork all the time. And the last like 5 or 6 things I've done have been heavily illustrated. They've been more illustrated than my earlier stuff. So,
do you find one or the other comes first? Do you get an image or words first?
It's really different from every piece. Sometimes I'll make a story based on an idea that I'm drawing, like just doodling. Sometimes it flows naturally. Like, I'll just blurt out a story on typing in Word or on a piece of paper, and then I'll make an image for it like right away, and it's just like one breath. Sometimes it's chunky, like it takes a long time to kind of chew up and grind through things, and you end up with a whole bunch of knots, and then you have to unravel them, and sometimes you just toss it. I'm like, it's not worth it. But most of the time I'll try to get through it and see something salvageable from the creative process.
I think of poetry as the verbal equivalent of abstract art in a lot of ways.
Okay.
Do you find that your illustrations tend to be more abstract when you're illustrating poetry?
Sometimes. Some of my poetry is very specific. Like, I have poetry has a start and a finish. Like, it goes through a flow and has a resolution. Yeah, sometimes it's very abstract. My interest in poetry, like one of the bigger inspirations for continuing to write poetry was this book that I read called The Art of Poetry by Horace. Horace was a Roman poet that was translated in the 1700s, but he was a court poet. And The Art of Poetry is about kind of the value of poetry in a political scene.
Oh.
He was a court poet, and the Romans during this time really valued poetry because they're superstitious. They have a whole lot of ways of trying to organize it. But one of the big things that he has in his book that I took away is that poetry can be used as a type of not only abstract language, but as a language to describe what's going on in the world. So what's going on right now, nobody really has the ability to look at it in hindsight. So we don't have the ability to like construct it in an organized or orderly way. So we use poetry. We'll talk about a romantic experience, and not romantic as in like love, but as in like a personal like epiphany or experience of the true sense of the term romanticism. Epiphany is a great one. Vengeance, like that's a very powerful personal feeling emotion that is kind of reflected in a lot of that romance or that romantic experience in poetry.
I love that. And don't you wish that was a job now? Court poet.
Oh, yeah, it would be amazing.
Read a job description for that. I would love that. Well, great. Tell me a little bit about your work with the B-Town blog, because that kind of marries your writing with the community.
Okay. I started writing for the B-Town blog last year at about December, November time, and it happened from Arts Aglow. So my partner did a display in the museum called The Silver Mysteries of Night, and it was an art exhibit that she did for Arts Aglow. And she wanted a book. She wanted something that was like a tome or something mysterious. And she was like, I need a poem. So I wrote a poem for her, and then she liked it. And so my partner is Amber, and I think that she might be on later as an interviewer.
Yes.
But she's a big part of like my other half of brain when it comes to like doing art things. So a lot of that back and forth that happens and development happens from interaction with artists, specifically my partner. But I had written some poems for Arts Aglow, and the B-Town blog, somebody from the B-Town blog asked me if I wanted to do any articles about things because they liked it. This was Scott from the blog.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I've been doing reviews from events that I would go to, like the Vision 2020 or Arts Aglow or that kind of thing, and just talk about what I see and hear through the eyes of somebody who sees maybe more poetically or something interesting or some sort of method. And ever since then, I've been just writing my opinions and my experiences and that kind of thing, and maybe once a month, maybe once every other month.
Great. I noticed a few of your pieces are also more maybe like the philosophy of art, and I really enjoyed those. I have a background in philosophy, and
Oh, nice.
and so I enjoy those pieces, just thinking about art as a living entity and the process of creating it and how it affects lives and all these things I find really fascinating. What's the name of your column if people want to go?
It's called the Art Corner.
Art Corner on the B-Town blog. Raymond Street
Yes.
writes that, and I would encourage you to check it out. And speaking of art and philosophy, what is your creative philosophy when it comes to creation and how you approach art?
So my philosophy for art is might take a while to explain, but there's a couple of distinct points that are practical. One is to do small pieces. So sometimes a big piece is too, like, I don't know what a book is going to look like when it's all done, but I know that I want to talk about a couple of ideas. And so you explore them, you write them down, you look at them, maybe you expand something out. But you start with little pieces and you pile them all up, and then you have a big piece when you're done. And sometimes you just need to do some transitioning or maybe have somebody else read it to kind of help some of that flow. But for the most part, it's adding those things up and then getting a big thing. And then the second thing that I really focus on is the idea of interruption. So a lot of people look at the creative process as something you need isolation from. And I like the idea that, this is from a quote from somebody that's inspiring. His name is Kurt Vonnegut.
Yes.
And he said, 2/3 of a masterpiece is enough. And that is, I don't want to resent interruption. So like your cat comes up and bothers you, or you have to be interrupted because you have to go to work or to go to bed or take care of something, and you can grow resentful for the things that are interrupting your creative process. And I noticed this very early, and I was like, nope, I'm not going to go down that route. That the idea of collaboration and creativity sometimes comes from these things that are not you. They're conversations from friends. They're conversations when you're on a walk, something you see when you're out and about and involved in things rather than being isolated.
Yeah.
So go to a coffee shop.
And,
get inspired by the things around you. Go to an event and be impressed by the things seen and heard. And that's where I find a lot of my creativity is really immersing yourself. I call it leftover gonzo journalism. Is from Hunter S. Thompson, and that the idea to report on something is to be within it.
Yeah.
And so just go there and see what there is to see without necessarily making conclusions, and then you get to kind of go through that. What do you feel? What do you see? What things can you bring together?
Can't draw from an empty well.
Yeah. And the other one is to surround yourself. This is kind of the same idea, but I hear people wanting to be creative in a work environment.
Yeah.
We need to think outside the box. We need to go do this thing. And some of that is because their environment is so sterile. Like corporate environment is white walls, bare cubicles, meeting rooms that are designed to be more about information display.
Yeah.
Rather than there's no elaborate abstracts. There's no, decorations or motifs. There's no, little gingerbread on architecture inside of the corporate building. It's all very, and that can really, I think, limit creativity, not being surrounded by other creative forces.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're in a creative role inside one of those companies, it's also bad. I used to manage a team of writers in a company, and it wasn't corporate, it was a startup, but even still, I'm like, you can't keep your creatives in meetings all morning and expect them to have creative output in the afternoon. It's just not gonna work.
No.
you gotta let them be writers, and sometimes that means writing feverishly in the middle of the night, and sometimes it means you'll have some focus time in the morning, but it's pretty unpredictable, I think.
And that's knowing yourself, what time you're creative. I know that between 10 and what time is it now? 1 o'clock? Yeah, or something between 10 and 1. I have the most energy to go and write stuff down, and then I'll refine or do stuff later in the day. But outside of that period of day, I have a lot harder time getting into that stuff. So just knowing yourself, maybe.
Yes, the afternoon for me is just a complete dead zone. It's just it's not going to work. After 1:30 until 6 at least, it's just no focused writing work's going to get done. I can invoice, I can email, but I'm not going to be creative at that time. Unfortunately, nighttime seems to be the best, and the world is not structured for night owls, so that can be difficult. But you do what you got to do. You said something, I loved the idea of rolling with interruptions, because that can be so off-putting, especially if you're the kind of person who's I got to create the perfect environment before I can create. And life is full of little interruptions. Like you said, it could be as simple as your cat coming in the room, or your phone dinging, or whatever it is, someone asking you a question. And it reminded me, it's not completely related, but it reminded me of something that I heard recently, which is that the term multitasking was invented for computers to describe how computers process in the 1980s. And prior to that, it wasn't a phrase. And that human beings actually cannot multitask. Even if you're doing more than one thing, you're only doing one at a time.
That's true.
So that basically, if you're doing a thing, be doing that thing. And that can also include interruptions. I'm interrupted right now. Instead of being frustrated about that, I'm just going to accept I'm interrupted right now.
Time to go take care of some chores.
Right, I'm going to observe that, I'm going to roll with it, and then I'm going to go back instead of being I'm going to feverishly multitask, which is not a thing people can do. It's a thing computers can do. And that's something I've been thinking about.
So when I get interrupted, say I have to go do something, I try to just keep it going. So you can crystallize or refine or abstract an idea down to a little bit more of a moat. Sometimes when you're just thinking about it and you can't write it down, you just churning it over. So when I finally get back to the computer or to my notebook, then I just boom, done. I'm able to dump it out. All the cognitive ability was done while I was doing dishes or something.
That's true too. I've heard it's not an exact quote, but basically like writers are writing all of the time. It's not just pen to paper, but you're doing that cognitive building in the background if you are washing the dishes or feeding the cat.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to putting pen to paper, it can be more like boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, I just try to accept that every piece that I write is going to have its own flow and not to try to force it. Be like, yeah, maybe it will come, maybe it won't. And I try not to, I guess this would be another creative philosophy, is that guilt and inspiration are usually opposite. And this is for me. Some people, maybe they have guilt that they want to express and that's part of their art. But for me, being guilty about not doing art and being inspired to do art are two different brain states that I was like, if I don't do art ever again in my life, that's okay. At least I did it once. And I think that if everybody just kind of gives it a shot for a little bit, even if it's not something they like they at least went through that practice and participated rather than just consumed.
Yeah, I love that. Because I think guilt about not creating enough or not creating, quote unquote, correctly, all these ideas that we get about how to create art really create blocks in a lot of artists that are really hard to overcome. I don't know if you've ever read Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. In there, she talks about the idea of art being a living entity that artists have relationships with. And so she's talking about when you're feeling uninspired or guilty or whatever it is that's blocking you, try to woo art like you would any other relationship, trying to build a bridge back to it, which I thought was a really interesting approach to blocking. But I think the kind of things you're talking about of just acceptance of the present moment is also huge and so hard. I don't know why it's so hard, but it really is. So speaking of challenges, what challenges have you encountered as an artist, either these internal blocks we're talking about or externally, kind of like you were talking about with publishing, of trying to get your work out there or not wanting to put your work out there, which is something a lot of artists struggle with too. Like, I want to create, but I don't want anyone to see it, but I also want everyone to see it. Talk a little bit about your challenges.
So part of that challenge comes from this idea that, from my perspective, being an artist often means practicing in public.
Yeah.
So people get to see me make mistakes or not do the best, or a grammar mistake, or I misspelled something. So a lot of the challenge for me is putting my perception into what other people would see. And it's very difficult for, especially writing within a certain time frame. So it takes me like 5 or 6 days to get out of a piece where I can look at it a little bit more removed, where I could be more critical or fix editing issues on my own. I rely on sometimes my friends, my partner Amber, she will help me with editing, so I'll have somebody else look at it right after I did it to catch a lot of that stuff, and then I'll look at it again later. But the perception of getting out of my work is probably the hardest part. And then the other one would probably be just duration. It's always a challenge for me to write a novella because it has a different kind of structure that's away from poetry or short stories. It feels like it has a lot more meat that has to be filled out and a little bit slower of a mental rhythm to get through it. It's not as fast. Poetry is very fast. Feels like you're getting all of it right at once and you kind of have to unravel it slowly. But as with novellas or novels, you have to go quite a bit slower in your thought process. And that's hard for me.
I hear that. Long form writing is a whole other beast entirely, and I'm in awe of people who can do that so well, and especially if they're converging storylines and points of view and all this stuff. It's like, oh, wow.
That's why people go to school and take classes and do all that stuff, and I totally get that. And I have friends that are in academic school for writing, and it's awesome to talk to them and hear a lot of that secondhand. But I have no academic training in writing. I just have loved to read and write my whole life. So that's...
I think some of the best training is reading and writing and just doing. So, and a lot of published authors, very famous published authors, will say the same. Is just do it. Sit down and do it, and you'll learn along the way. What about your triumphs? What are you most proud of?
So I had been thinking about this, and I have a reader. Her name is Sarah, and Sarah didn't like my reading when she first read it. She doesn't like my horror or my fantasy or that kind of stuff, but she really likes my articles for the B-Town blog. She loves to hear my perception of that. And for me, it was kind of a victory or a success that I could have a different voice or a different prose that somebody would like when they didn't like other things that I did. So that to have the variety of writing to hit and miss somebody that's a friend that they can tell me, hey, I didn't really like that. And I'm like, thank you. But then they also tell me when they do like something, and that was nice. I think the biggest victory though was I had my artwork up, and one of my friends' kids, she was like 3 years old, and she saw my artwork and she says, "I want to be an artist too," and that was like, oh man, that's it, I'm done.
Yes, I win at life.
I win.
I'm inspiring a child. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's up there with art commission stuff where seeing people interact or be supported or encouraged to do artwork or feel that they can, that's something I would consider a triumph or virtue or win. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. You said something that sparked a thought, and hopefully it's not gone forever. I'll try to retrieve it.
Okay.
You said, what was your, I was wondering if, especially if it's a friend and they don't really like the thing that you did, do you have a way as an artist of not taking that personally? Because art is such an expression of the self. It can be tricky not to feel like, that's a rejection of self. But it's not. It's just that, and it's not even a rejection of the art per se. It's just this is not my thing.
There's a vulnerability that goes to expressing yourself and having people analyze it and read it and consume it. So when I first started writing short stories, my mother gave me some advice. And she said that a writer is like a fly on the wall. And that even though it is a lot of self-expression, it comes from the things that, I choose to put these things in the book. Yeah. It is my intention. But a lot of those things are they're captured pieces of an emotional thing. So I'm usually pretty okay with things that I write. It's all fantasy. And my perception of fantasy and science fiction is there are ways to talk about philosophy or ideas without them being real. They can be fake. You can talk about anything from slavery to oppression to love to anything you can think of, but you put a science fiction glamour on it, you put a fantasy glamour on it, and it becomes consumable to people that would normally reject those things. So I don't know where I was really going with that, other than I really, I guess, appreciate trying to keep as much of myself out of it. So I have this is my recent book, and this has a lot of things, including a one called, it's not in this one, but Birds and the Bees. I write sometimes about things that are just 100% real. The Birds and the Bees is a story about my chickens. I keep chickens and bees. And it was about this day that we harvested honey from these bees. And the process and what it smelled like, and such a rich aroma and experience, and it takes a long time. But our chickens, they have their own type of world and issues and that kind of thing. And just letting people know what I see from that perspective, yes, it is part of me, but it's the chickens and it's the bees. It's
their world.
I'm not exaggerating it. I mean, I don't feel like I am. Maybe I am, but it's their world that I'm just kind of giving the space for. And I thought that might be interesting to write about. I wanted to write about my chickens and write about my bees. And I find that I don't have a lot of self vulnerability to that. You do it for a while. This is my 13th self-published book.
Wow.
The first self-published book, yes, didn't want to read anything out loud. I was very careful about who I gave it to, that kind of thing. And eventually, you let go of that. You're like, I'm just going to leave it at a coffee shop, even if it gets thrown away. I'll put it at a library stand, even if it gets thrown away. And you tend to accept that there are mountains, literal mountains of unread literature out there, and you're just another writer.
Yeah.
So if somebody reads it at all, I'm happy. That's it. If they like it or don't like it, it's okay to have an opinion. It's okay to be that way, and it's awesome. Art is a great place for bias. It's a great place for opinion and subjectivity, because it's all those inner type of dynamics having a almost a symbolic representation of what's going on. There's shapes and colors and ideas, but it's all that stuff that's up in here.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yep. So you mentioned this is your latest book. What do you have in the works now, or is this kind of what you've been working on lately?
No, this came out in 2022. This is my last self-published book. Since then, I've done 4 or 5 zines, and they're all 4 or 5 things. And right now, I could probably put all of them into a book and make a collection.
Nice, yeah,
and I'll probably be working on that. But there is a story that I'm working on, and I'm always happy to talk about this. I started this in beginning of November after some conversations with my friend who's in academia, he was running a class on vampires. So it was all the literature, the music, movies, all that kind of stuff, the history. All they've been doing this for like multiple months of what it means, vampire tropes, all that kind of stuff. So I got inspired, and I'm writing a vampire novel where the vampire is an astronaut. So it's a vampire that lives in ancient, like Babylonian history, and he goes through and kind of his perception of watching human history. And there's something that has happened in which there's no more vampires are able to be made. So he's like one of the last ones, but they go out into space. And anyway, that's what I'm working on now.
That is fascinating. I've never heard of a story of vampires in space. That's cool.
Thanks.
That is really cool. So how can the community support you as a local artist?
I have books for sale. You're always happy to buy my books. But if I was to ask the community to support art or artists, I would say to pay musicians and pay artists for things. Because part of just being an art commissioner and being an art advocate is that artists and musicians get exploited so often for exposure or to do things for free. And even just $50, even just a little bit of money, like making sure they get paid is like a really big, I guess, vision for me, and it's something that I try to instill with the art commission, like whenever we have events, to make sure we pay for musicians, pay for artists if they're going to do something. There was this last year in 2023, this is I think you might find this to be an interesting story. We had one of our musicians, we had to reschedule due to the air quality. It was in August, and we had to juggle these things, and we ended up having this artist move to the last date that we had for our Music in the Park series, and her rest of her band couldn't join her, and she's a jazz piano player. Her name is I'm trying to remember her first name, Albero. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember her first name real quick, because I should definitely let you know if I'm going to tell this story. Romana Albero. Anyway, I can get you her name, but she played this dulcimer, and it was fantastic. It was so beautiful, and it was improv. She did an hour and a half improv.
Hour and a half.
Of this dulcimer style, and it sounded like Spanish guitar.
Oh, wow, on a dulcimer. Was it a hammer dulcimer or a mountain
dulcimer?
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, and I can get you her name. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now.
That's okay. I'd love to hear it.
And we're going to try to get her back for 2024 with the full jazz setup. But,
yes, that would be great. That'd be great. Yeah. That support and rolling with it is. I was doing an interview last week about how everyone should hire artists, because especially theater people, you literally keep the show going when the house is literally on fire. Yeah. You can just see you very adaptable, flexible, professional, and the show goes on. Last question. What's a personal mantra or motivational quote that you live by?
Let's see.
Or just a quote that inspires you.
A quote that inspires me. Well, I don't know if inspiration is necessarily the right word, but it is something that motivates me to write, and that is, I have this historical perception of things that I have realized and studied, that pessimists, people that just kind of assume that things are going to get worse, are woefully inadequate. That it tends to be far worse than people anticipate, and that's a really good perception for being like, okay, well, the world ends tomorrow. Am I happy with what I've written? Have I done all the stuff I want to do? I mean, like, we don't know how long we're going to have to be able to make art or do things. So there's a type of, like, I guess, urgency.
Yes.
A provocation of that instinct, life instinct, to get that fire under you type of thing. But yeah, my look on life tends to be a little dismal, but I find that kind of idea very inspiring and good. Yeah,
that's a great a great perspective on what most would consider pessimism is if everything's awful, that either means, everything's awful, full stop, and that's sort of nihilism, or it means everything's awful, therefore nothing matters, therefore everything kind of does, like everything kind of has its own little bit of magic because it's here for a second and gone. Okay. Though I like that. It's a different perspective on how difficult life can be / is. Well, great. We're going to wrap up here with some reading.
Okay.
Raymond's going to read some excerpts from his latest book. And if you will give the title of the work before you read and where people can buy your work as
Okay.
well.
Okay. So you can buy my work either from my Blogspot, Facebook, or Instagram links, but physical locations, you can buy Dreams of the Dragon, which is a book available at the Highline Heritage Museum. And I have a couple of titles available at Fantagraphics in Georgetown, which is going to be Cosmic Cuisine, Dreams of the Dragon, and a couple of other ones from previous years.
Wonderful.
All right, so this one is called Dreamcatcher. This is from Cosmic Cuisine in 2022. All right. My left arm hurts, bruised at the pit and bent in the middle. I keep it close to my body, guarded like a riddle, hidden under dreams and pulled apart at the seams. I raised my hand once. My mouth was full of secrets. Spiders ran out. I held in a shout. Black legs and 8 eyes. No one noticed my surprise. I put my arm down. I felt them squirming around. More spiders in the dark. Heavy shadows. No sound. No way to let them escape without my pain being found. When everyone is asleep, I'm not afraid of being bitten. The spiders made their home in me. I changed my clothes and more crawled away. I brushed my teeth and some fell to the floor. How many do I have? How many more? Spiders pulled my arms together. They closed the armpit door. They wait and they abstain. Who knows for how long or what they're waiting for? My hair has turned into a web, catching dreams in thoughtless lace, erased by morning without a trace. I'm happy to share my nightmares. I don't mind my arm hurting. There's plenty of room in this empty place.
That's lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, and here's a picture of it. I guess
Yes, for those watching on video, he's got an illustration.
it's a picture of somebody laying down with cobwebs coming out of their head. And let's see. I have one more, and this one's a true story. This is a poem that is a true story. This was something that happened when I went for a walk. So it's called Broken Wing. This is from the same book of Cosmic Cuisine. We took a walk into the woods on the trail to the sea, around the roots not washed away, over hills held up by trees. We found a bat along the way, a tiny thing beneath a leaf. Its wing was ripped and bent away. Needle teeth clicked out a cry, screaming for relief. I carried it in my hands, returning to my home, to warm their bones and give them space and heal if they can. Water droppers and little worms, a cardboard box apartment. Overnight I let them rest and gave them time to mend. In the morning they would not eat, a bone was sticking out. There was no light for Broken Wing, nothing left to do. So I placed them in my icy heart. I held them there in silence. An empty quiet was all there was as their life departed. And now they sleep inside my head, a shadow and a ghost, a broken wing and tiny teeth, for now I am a host. And here's a little picture of this little bat that I found in an ice cube. So in this particular poem, the term icy heart is memory. So I'll remember them.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Once again, that's Raymond Street reading from his work, Cosmic Cuisine, that is available for you to buy and enjoy. And thank you for joining us today for the B-Town Breakdown. And join us next week on Friday at 6 p.m. at 106.5 KQWZ LP.
Tune in for a new show every Friday at 106.5 KQWZ LP FM, South King County.